When people ask me what it feels like to jump out of a plane with a parachute, I say, in all seriousness, it's just like getting out of bed in the morning. You know how it is. Some mornings, you hate to get up. Other times, when you have something important to do, you bound out with no thought of the hardships involved. Well, that's the way it is with parachuting. It all depends on what's on your mind. And that is the first paragraph of the first chapter of the book that I'm going to be bringing to you today. And I'm going to bring it to you in two parts because it's a particularly favorite book of mine, and there's just so much awesome content in it that I just can't justify cramming it into one podcast. There's too much I would have to admit. And this favorite book of mine is titled We Jumped to Fight by Colonel Edson D. Raff, written in 1944. And Colonel Raff, in my mind, and hopefully in yours after I finish with this small series, is the epitome of the United States Army paratrooper. Bold, honest, and fearless in battle. A volunteer for the most dangerous and innovative of jobs in the Army at the time. Edson Raff made the very first combat jump of all time with the United States Army Airborne into North Africa in 1943. And then, characteristic of his indomitable nature, Edson Raff also made the very last combat jump of World War II with the U.S. Army Airborne being the first man out the door over Nazi-occupied Germany in Operation Varsity, the jump on the Rhine. So this man, just in his World War II service, because his service extends before and long after the Second World War, just in World War II with his service in the Airborne, he did incredible things. And, as I said, the epitome of leadership, the epitome of a paratrooper in the Second World War. So I have to bring this book to you. And this book is also the first book of a series that I'm going to be bringing to this podcast, a series on my favorite unit of World War II, the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion. I want to bring a series of podcasts and lectures to the channel talking about the 509th in World War II. Their combat experience in the Second World War was renowned, but not as renowned as it should be, in my opinion. Not enough people know about them, and more people should. They were the first soldiers into combat, and their unit, just a battalion, forever independent, and a bastard unit, as the men called it, in the official unit history written after the war. This lone battalion made more combat jumps than any other unit. Entire divisions, such as the 101st or the 82nd, their combat career pales in comparison to the 509th. As I said, more people should know about them, and I don't want to give away their whole story here, but Colonel Edson D. Raff was the founding commander of the 509th. He led the battalion on their first jump in North Africa and was promoted out of leadership of the battalion after his famous leadership in North Africa, both in 2 combat jumps and then independent action as a small organized task force taking on Rommel's Africa Corps successfully before everybody else. Historians look back on the American Army in North Africa during the Second World War with a kind of blasé attitude. They think of Kasserine Pass, where American troops, green and fresh on the battlefield, were defeated by the seasoned Africa Corps, and therein learned many valuable lessons. What they fail utterly to take into account, and what is simply not mentioned in most broad-scope histories of the Second World War and North Africa, is Colonel Raff's own task force, the Tunisian Task Force, comprised of Englishmen, American paratroopers, American armored units, and American infantry, all thrown in under this indomitable colonel, taking on the Afrika Korps successfully. And that is what's going to come in the second podcast. The first podcast here, I just want to bring you the first part of Edson Raff's own book he wrote in 1944 about his experiences joining the airborne, training, and then those first 2 combat jumps of all time, which he personally led in North Africa. I'm going to bring that to you today and bring you some narrative to put the quotes I have from the book in context. Now, I'm going to be splitting this book into 2 podcasts because it's a personal favorite of mine on a unit I particularly adore. And as I said, there's so much in this book, I can't ever get one podcast out of it. And I still do not think 2 podcasts are going to do it justice. So, as I always do, I especially urge my listeners, these 2 podcasts, to go on and buy this book. If you think you are a fan of World War II airborne, World War II parachute tactics, or leadership in general, because Edson Raff, in my mind, is one of the most amazing combat infantry leaders of all time. And he's relatively unknown. He went on after the war to be instrumental in the formation of the U.S. Army Special Forces. Edson Raff is the reason the Green Berets got their Green Berets. But that's a story for the second podcast and maybe beyond. And I have brought you there in the very first selection of the book, his opening paragraph. People ask me what it's like to parachute out of an airplane, and I say in all seriousness, I love this. It's just like getting out of bed in the morning. I love that. And that's exactly the kind of man Edson Raff is. Hard-charging, indomitable, and a real leader. So, Edson Raff began his Army career, believe it or not, as a first lieutenant serving in Hawaii. And he was there for 6 months on the defensive duty in 1940. And he was getting pretty tired of the static defensive work of patrolling the Hawaiian Islands. This is before Pearl Harbor. And jumping ahead in the book, this is him talking about the first time he heard about the paratroops. And this is while he's serving in Hawaii. One day in August 1940, an article in the New York Times caught my eye. It was the announcement that a test platoon of American parachutists had been formed at Fort Benning, Georgia, and had gone into training there. The possibility struck me that our army might be developing parachute troops similar to those known to be in the Russian and German armies. Not being sure if a first lieutenant of infantry having a CAA commercial pilot's license and a yen for adventure possessed the necessary qualifications, I nevertheless decided then and there to be a parachutist. Jumping ahead in the book, Edson Raff promptly submits a letter requesting transfer to the brand new parachute corps. And he doesn't immediately hear back. So jumping ahead slightly in the book, great was my chagrin. And I had to look up that word, chagrin. Chagrin essentially means intense embarrassment at the thought of failure. So That's not a word used lightly, and this is an educated man having gone to a prep school and being captain of the prep school cadets there. He's highly educated, and he doesn't use that word lightly. It's the only time it shows up in the book. Chagrin. He's embarrassed that he has failed at this ambition he's already put forward to himself. And again, this is his indomitable spirit that I just love. Great was my chagrin. Waves and waves of mental telepathy had been sent towards the chief's office in Washington during those past months, but had utterly failed to produce results. On my return to the States and to Washington, I visited the War Department to see what had happened at the receiving end. Everyone was far too busy there to receive anything from me verbally or telepathically. Sheepishly, I asked one officer what had happened to my parachute detail request. He never found out. So here's a guy. In 1940, before the war breaks out, when the parachute test platoon of 40 men, it's a very small unit, is announced in the New York Times, he decides to become a parachutist. Sends in an application, doesn't hear anything for the duration of his time in Hawaii, and he says he's kicking up sand on Oahu's white beaches, and he's watching this failure in his mind to become a parachutist unfold. So when he returns to the United States, he goes to the War Department, and he personally goes and inquires. This guy needs to become a paratrooper. I love this. Going back to the book. Then, one day, there it was. Quote, detailed to report not later than June 1st to the 501st Parachute Battalion at Fort Benning, Georgia. If it had said not later than 12 noon this date, I would have been there ahead of time. At Fort Benning, I reported for duty to two officers. The first was Lieutenant Colonel William H. Miley, commanding officer and organizer for the 501st Parachute Battalion. So there he is. He goes to Fort Benning. He's got his assignment, and if he could have, he would have been early. He's getting after it. I love it. And I'm pardon my enthusiasm, folks. This book and this man is an inspiration. So there's my bias. I am a fanboy, 100%. All right, moving on in the book. On June 4th, parachute training began. Only once did I have the slightest doubt about my determination to jump. It came the day we were first hauled to the top of the 250-foot tower. I looked around Fort Benning with nothing underneath me but air. My voice accusingly said aloud, "There are many fool things you've gotten yourself into before, young man, but this is the damnedest. How are you going to get out of it?" With that, the controlled chute let go, and I dropped down. Never since then has there been the least doubt in my mind that paratrooping is my job. And I think that quote's really interesting because it confirms what Mark Bando recorded in his book about the 101st and their training, where men often had the most reservation about jumping from the 250-foot controlled parachute towers, because the ground looks far away and soft outside of an airplane, but when you're at the top of essentially a telephone pole rigged into a harness, the ground is all much more closer, but the mortality is still present. So there you go. Moving on in the book. And here he is in an airplane, conducting his first jump. Before I knew it, numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 had gone. Then came number 7. "Captain Raff, stand up," yelled Lieutenant Walters. "Hook up." I hooked up. "Stand in the door." There I stood, looking out at the earth moving slowly by at 1,500 feet. My hands lightly touched the metal fuselage, ready to make the push off. The propeller wash, we call it the prop blast, came through the door in intermittent gusts. Thus, on the threshold of a new world, I waited for the fatal go. I felt a tap on my right leg. Walter was saying, "Go, go," and out I went. Deep down, a submerged voice seemed to be counting. 1,000, 2,000, but before I could finish 3,000, there was a jerking on my shoulders, and I knew the chute had opened. It was a peculiar pain, strangely exhilarating. In spite of frequent shoulder bruises from the opening jar, the real joy of having that chute open knows no bounds. There was plenty of time to gaze around as a slight breeze drifted the chute and me to the south. After looking up at the canopy to see that it was completely open, I tried some turns and slips. Then I gazed around more. First at the windsock on a Lawson Field hangar, then at Benning's red buildings, and as I turned at the brown Chattahoochee, keeping apart the shores of Georgia and Alabama. I noticed as I looked down that the earth seemed to be coming up towards me. The speed of its approach increased, and for the first time I realized my drift was rearward. Working the risers, they run from the shoulders of the lines running down from the chute. I prepared to land. Both feet hit the ground at once, then a backward somersault, and the jump was over. The grassy field underfoot felt solid and good. And that's from a letter Edson Raff wrote to his aunt about his first parachute jump. So moving ahead in the book, Edson Raff earns his parachute wings and gets assigned to the 504th Parachute Infantry Battalion. And the 504th Parachute Infantry Battalion later gets renamed the 2nd of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment. So the 504th Battalion gets renamed because there's a aspiration among the hierarchy of command to turn it into a full regiment, the 503rd Regiment. But it's still a single battalion. So they're called kind of arbitrarily the 2nd Battalion of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, of which there are usually 3 or 4 battalions. So anyways, back to the book. Just wanted to get that nomenclature out of the way because early on in World War II, these parachute battalions were still being formed, and there's a bit of confusion as they're being shuffled around and organized into divisions and etc. So back to the book. On December 6th, 1941, my chance to join a combat unit came. The 504th Parachute Battalion needed an executive officer. Could I have the job? The day before Pearl Harbor, my service with troops was resumed. The 504th was an excellent group of men, commanded by Major Dick Chase. They had developed fast along sound lines. They were too new to have lost many men by cadres to other organizations. Their tactical training, their jumping, and their morale was of a high order. In March 1942, the 504th Parachute Battalion changed its name. It became the 2nd Battalion of the 503rd Parachute Infantry, one of 2 newly organized parachute regiments. Colonel Miley commanded the 503rd Regiment, which moved to Fort Bragg for further training. I rose from executive officer to commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, receiving a temporary promotion to major. On and on went our training. Night and day, the battalion pumped on or hiked through the Overhills area. The keenness of the men was apparent. When I told them that we were going places someday, that our battalion would do any and all jobs fighting either the Japs, the Germans, or both, if I had to volunteer to do it, they cheered. I knew they could fight, but one thing I instilled in them: they must be more than mere jumpers. They were ground fighters, troopers with parachutes, who must view the trip to battle as nothing more than a truck ride. Jump-happy parachutists were regarded with contempt by any man. They gloried not solely in jumping, but being able to move fast and stealthily after hitting the ground. Sometime in May 1942, Colonel Miley called Major Walsh, the 1st Battalion commander, and me over to flip a coin for a battalion trip to Washington. The occasion was the Memorial Day Parade. My battalion won the toss, but 1st Battalion paraded. While Major Walsh's battalion was marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, we were awaiting shipment overseas. On June 11th, 12 days later, we were on foreign soil, the British Isles, after a trip which, when stories can be told, deserves a place of its own in the annals of the world's most hectic journeys. So Major Raff completely glosses over the boat ride over, which I'm going to get into in a future podcast. I'm bringing another book from the 509th to the channel, written by his CEO, or his executive officer, Major Yardley. And Major Yardley in his diaries actually goes in and details some of the more amusing anecdotes of the boat ride over. So like Edson Raff, we're not going to get into that here. We're going to follow the book. But I will be bringing details of that hectic boat ride, as Raff puts it, to the channel, because it's another example of Raff's leadership and his indomitable spirit. I digress, folks. Moving ahead. And this is once they arrived in England. They get off the boat. The Tommy Band was playing Yankee tunes as our troops lined up. It was a never-to-be-forgotten sight to see those American soldiers in their steel helmets with pistols at their sides, each one carrying in his hands another weapon of some kind. If our American soldiers didn't indicate to the British who saw them that they meant business, the point was missed. We hadn't come for fun at all. All of us wanted and anticipated action. At the camp, living quarters consisted mainly of Nissan huts, the type usually found in Britain. Now, I'm going to pause here and describe what a Nissan hut is. American speech is a Quonset hut. So it's like think about a 50-gallon oil drum cut in half and then sat on the ground with a door in the front of it with some windows on the sides. It's like a semi-cylindrical building. That's a Nissan hut. They're put up quick, and they're used to house troops in. And if you don't know what a Quonset hut is, or by that description you don't know what I'm talking about, just look up Quonset hut on the internet, and you'll be able to notice pretty quick. Anyways, going back to the book. Officers lived in a beautiful lodge, surrounded by lawns and gardens, typically English. The owner of the estate, an American woman by birth, cordially welcomed us. I have since wondered if she ever guessed that our detailed part of the invasion drama was planned months later within the walls of her mansion. Major Smith Pigott showed me around the camp, then led all the officers to the mess where we sat down to an American steak dinner. Those steaks and the individual cakes of soap provided for each officer and man were rarities in Britain just then, but somehow produced for us. Some difficulty, I learned later, had been encountered in requisitioning an American flag for the camp flagpole, but Old Glory was flying gaily the day we arrived, though officially it was covering the coffin of a fictitious American soldier who supposedly had died in a neighboring British unit. I'm a bit incensed when people say the British lack ingenuity. Soon after our arrival, Major General F.A.M. Browning, DSO, commanding a British airborne division, became our immediate operational superior. Some of his parachute troops had taken part in the famous Bruneval raid, and we learned a lot from them. By being part of a British airborne division, firing areas, airborne facilities, and supplies were available to us, which at the time were impossible to obtain from the American headquarters in London. We profited greatly by the arrangement, and in some ways, the British benefited from association with us. General Browning proved my most sincere official friend. And I think this is a this is a demonstration of Raff's impeccable leadership. Not only he's making connections, so not only is he getting his unit ready, he's making personal relationships. He's founding personal relationships with the English counterparts that he's working with. Because I know from studying this history extensively and reading many other books other than just this one, that the American supply chain in England was essentially non-existent at this time. The 509th, or excuse me, at this time, the 503rd Parachute Infantry Battalion, they were the first American combat infantrymen in England at the time. And actually, when they went over on the boat only had Air Force, personnel, only guys who were the rear echelon, so to speak, and desk jockeys, so to speak. And these infantrymen, there's not an established chain of command or supply chain to get them what they need. So it's imperative that they make friends with the English, whose airborne program had been going long before the Americans, and in many ways influenced the American program a great deal. So the fact that General Browning and the English are providing for the Americans and the Americans are helping benefit them, it's good. It's a good leader who can forge those ties. Especially, ties that extend across the Atlantic. Putting aside nationality to make friends and make good relationships for the benefit of everybody. Moving on in the book. So this is after the men have been training with the English for a bit. But at the end of July, morale began to sag. AWOLs increased. And anybody who's listening, AWOL is an acronym. It's absent without leave. So guys are walking away from the base without permission. That's not good. Back to the book. The guardhouse was inhabited by too many good men. The battalion seemed to be going stale. The reason was that the prospect for early action seemed far distant. 10 men had gone to train with British paratroopers for possible raids in France, but nothing ever came of their schooling. Their return proved conclusively that, even for the select, action was further than just around the corner. To help ease the situation, Major Yardley, my executive officer, arranged trips to London, 100 men per weekend. We had frequent movies at night, a couple of British ENSA shows, and one show with Al Jolson, supported by various other famous Hollywood movie stars. Just before the latter performance, our paratroopers staged a jump for the actors, far more spectacular than anything the stars themselves did later. A series of normal drops were highlighted by an accidental low-altitude mass jump from 150 feet without casualties. The less said about it, the better. But truthfully, as I saw those soldiers pouring out of the transport so close to the ground, my first gray hair sprouted. Mr. Irvin, who designed the particular chute we used, would be interested to know that all the chutes functioned perfectly, and that there were no casualties. And in the States, we had worried about low jumps from 800 feet. So that's interesting. These guys are piling out of the ground at 150 feet. No casualties. The chutes work, and they were worried about low jumps from 800 feet. So you can see the equipment and the techniques, they're still getting there. And in many ways, real-world testing is still proving the limits of this equipment and the men. Moving ahead in the book. And this is the chapter titled Last Days in England. November 8th was fast approaching. Many last-minute details remained to be checked. Lieutenant Tipton, the battalion's supply officer, and his staff worked night and day, scouring depots for the 1,001 items paratroopers carry into battle. Salt tablets, extra grenades, pencils, additional small arms ammunition. These were some of them. So I forgot to mention This is after they've received their assignment. So the morale's been slipping. These guys have been training. They're all pumped up. They're fired up. They want to go into combat. And the guys are going AWOL because they just got so much pent-up energy. And guys who serve in combat units can know that feeling. I've listened to Navy SEALs talk about how they get fired up. They want to go into combat. And before you've gone into combat, you think that, everything you've been training for will be validated the moment you hear those bullets go over your head, the moment you hit the ground in combat. So these guys, they want to be validated. They want to be tested. And the morale was slipping. So finally, the American High Command contacts him. General Mark Clark, who's leading the Americans at the time, contacts Edson Raff and says, "We got a mission for you. Can you do it?" And Edson Raff says, "Of course." He's fired up. He's ready to go. So now they're assembling everything they need. Back to the book. All men now knew their roles backward. We were practically ready to go. Morale, of course, was high. But in order to give it a final brace, I tried to persuade one of several generals in London to make an inspection of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Parachute Infantry. After all, we were the first American paratroopers completely equipped for and going into combat. Few people, even in the Army, realize what a combat paratrooper looks like. Some men weigh 300 pounds or more when they jump. I wanted someone to see them. The generals, however, were too busy planning for the big event. None of them could find time to come down to our camp. And again, this is a good commander. He's proud of his men, and he is aware of the historic significance of this jump. And he wants to show his men off the incredibly hard work they've been doing getting ready for this first operational combat jump. He wants to show them off. And you can tell in his writing, no, not one of them could find time to come down to our camp. I think he's a little fired up there over that. But moving on in the book, I shall always believe that some officer in London remembered my vain request for a general to inspect us because one day, out of a clear sky, someone from the American embassy phoned. "Miss Roosevelt is visiting your camp tomorrow at 10 a.m., he said. So there you have it. The First Lady of the United States visiting London at the time. She makes time to come visit the first American paratroopers ready to go. Back to the book. The next day, as that gracious lady walked down the line of paratroopers asking friendly questions, I sensed that my officers and men were bursting with pride to be inspected by her. We all keenly appreciated the honor our small unit was paid by her presence. She, in turn, seemed to enjoy her task. And as a military historian who studied the 2503 later, their name was changed again to the 509th, which is what I've been mentioning with more frequency. It's a good thing that Edson Raff was conscious of the historic precedent of his men going into combat. And it's even better that Miss Roosevelt came to visit them not only for their morale, but because her personal photographers came. And they documented with incredible clarity wonderful images of these men lined up, ready to go in their original combat uniforms as they would have appeared jumping into North Africa, because I've found less than half a dozen pictures taken of the 2503 while they were in Africa in combat. Combat is rarely conducive for photography, and that's one of the first things you realize as a military historian trying to study images from the time. So it's really awesome that these high-quality images preserved by Life magazine later, they're all available online if you can find them. I've, for my own archive, saved as many as I could because they show some amazingly rare equipment and they document the entire time they go on a parade for, or they have their interesting little early war airborne pieces of equipment that were discontinued almost immediately later because these tactics and equipment were constantly evolving. This is all documented by her personal photography team. So I digress. Just as a military historian, that little event yields quite a bit more than just a boost in the morale for the men. Anyways, moving on, that first mission that these men are all fired up for, and Miss Roosevelt comes to visit them before they leave, that mission is Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. And they weren't told until they were boarding the aircraft. Vague terms like Aerodrome Y, Town X, Landing Zone Z were used to keep the men in the dark because there was such intense operational security. The Op.6, as the military calls it, was intense. And for good reason. It was highly secretive, the Americans' first invasion of the war. So, moving on into the book, the men are in their airplanes and they're flying the longest flight in airborne history at the time, and I think withstanding. However, I'm not sure. Something like 1,500-mile trip from England to North Africa. They fly out over the ocean and around Spain to avoid invading their neutral airspace. And that long flight causes some problems, which we'll get into later. But as for now, back to the book. They're in the air and nearing North Africa. In the meantime, our formation had made a turn. We were heading east, flying just off the coast. So there it was, North Africa. Peaceful Africa. Waves of the Mediterranean beat in white streaks along its shore. Arab huts, sometimes clustered in little villages, came into view, then slid away behind the plane as we moved surely forward. For the first time the trip began, I spoke to Major Obendorf. "How about it, Ober? We doing all right?" "Guess so. Haven't much gas left. I'm sorry I had to give you such a rough ride." "Forget it. But how about the beam? Did you come in on it?" "I never heard it." Now, I'm going to pause here and digress, because I've read about this history. When he talks about the beam, there were actually two things, because Pathfinders had not been introduced yet. This is before Pathfinders. Okay, the first jump, they kind of had this crazy, almost like spy novel situation where they inserted a guy, an American Air Corps lieutenant who was recruited for this mission, who was an expert in radios, and they clandestinely inserted him with this kind of like spy agent suitcase that would release a homing beacon, and this guy made his way to the drop zone late in the middle of the night with a couple of Arabs with a couple of lights to try to guide the aircraft in, but that failed. They never heard it, as you can hear from the primary source here. They never heard the beam, so to speak, that they were going to home in on. So there's the first thing that went wrong. And also there was an English ship circling in an elliptical course 3 miles off the coast of Oran, which is where they're jumping in North Africa, transmitting on a radio frequency for them to home in on. And they never heard that because that ship was transmitting on the wrong frequency. So this is pre-Pathfinder. This is pre-Pathfinder jump. And as you can see, this was instrumental in later the formation of the Pathfinders, because they didn't home in on the right beam. They didn't home in on any beam, and this caused some serious problems. But anyways, moving on to the book. "Forget it. How about the beam? Did you come in on it?" "I never heard it." "Where are we now? Let's see the map." "We think we're here. Oran's there, but we're not too sure." "If Oran's so close, why don't we just go in and land? We've got a big day ahead of us." "We're turning now." The plane ahead was turning to the right. For what seemed like a long time, we flew inland. Nothing looked familiar. Not even the mountains which are close to Oran were in sight. Though it was sacrilegious to think such a thought at such a crucial moment, I could not help but wonder if we were lost. Having flown enough to know that when a pilot begins to circle, he is not sure of his bearings, I waited. 15 minutes must have passed before we banked left and commenced to turn. Looking out of the window, it was possible to see a large, flat area with small adobe-like Arab huts in one corner. One of 4 C-47s, presumably the lead plane, was just touching its wheels for a landing. Dust rose as it taxied to the huts. The remainder of the armada circled and circled. Exactly what happened on the ground was never quite clear, but the upshot of it was that a French-speaking Arab lived in one of the huts, directed us to Oran, some 100 miles away. Gas supply of many planes was running low. It was questionable whether or not we could reach La Siena. Over more hills flew our now greatly dispersed formation, over more country like the painted desert, barren and unmarked for anything except pinkish-brown hills. All eyes were straining for the first glimpse of the Sebreca de Oran. All ears were cocked and to catch the cough of a dry engine. Suddenly, the near edge of the Sebreca was in sight, and the rest of it even to the farthest shore. The dry mud lake was so immense it was incredible how we could have missed it. So here they are, and that lack of adequate pathfinding comes into play here because they're 100 miles where they should be. You know, they talk about in Normandy the scattered drops of guys in the Continian Peninsula, 3 miles from their drop zone, a couple miles from their drop. These guys are 100 miles from where they're supposed to be, and an airplane has to land, talk to some Arabs, and get directed, old school, talking to the natives to their drop zone. Meanwhile, they're all waiting to hear if their airplane engines are going to quit on them from lack of gasoline. So here we are. This is their first combat jump once they reach where they're supposed to be. And when they were jumping into North Africa, they weren't sure if the French were going to fight. So they actually trained for 2 plans. Plans peace and plan war. So with that knowledge, let's jump into the book here. The First Combat Jump and After Events, Chapter 7. The peace plan called for a landing at the French military aerodrome La Siena south of Oran. The war plan for a mass jump between La Siena and Aerodrome Y, or Tarfuri, where the French Naval Air School was situated. What actually happened was a combination landing and jump near Lormel, the town L of our plan, many miles from La Siena and Tarfuri. En route to La Siena, planes from the right flank of the Armada flew past Tarfuri airfield. Anti-aircraft guns and small arms from the aerodrome defenses opened fire on them. News of this unlooked-for action spread like wildfire over the C-47 radios. Immediately, all troop carriers in the vicinity turned west to avoid the 2 airfields. Obviously, something had gone wrong. The French weren't going to greet us with open arms and cheers, but to believe the French are hostile, after 12 hours of thinking the exact opposite, required a tremendous feat of mental gymnastics, so they actually took off under Plan Peace. But, like so much that had gone haywire already, now they're getting shot at, so they need to make a snap decision. And that is to commit to plan war, fly away from the small arms fire where the men will be vulnerable, and make a drop. Back to the book. Down the north edge of the Sebreca flew our C-47. In a few minutes, it was close to Lormel. Opposite the town on the dry lake bed, their propellers stopped, and the camouflage blending with the color of the dry mud surface rested 24 C-47s. Paratroopers and crews were deplaning, and the 6 airplanes, including ours, circling, preparing to land near the others. Just then, an excited voice cried over the radio. "The troops on the ground are digging in. They're being pinned down by fire from those armored cars on the road." We looked down. Sure enough, on the road there were armored cars, partially obscured by palm trees. Yet no flash of weapons being fired could be seen. Turning to Major Obendorf, I said quickly, "Well, Ober, this is it. We're gonna jump to knock out the armor and give the troops on the ground a chance to do something. Pick out a drop zone north of the road and ring the bell when you're ready. We'll take a few minutes to get our chutes on. Radio the other 5 planes to have jump masters get their men set." So here they go. This is why I love Edson Raff. There's armor on the ground, the worst thing for a lightly armed parachute infantry unit, and Edson Raff's getting after it. He's going to conduct the first parachute infantry jump to save his men on the ground and relieve them and knock out those armor. Failure's not an option. So here we go. The men who up till now had been idly watching the proceedings went into action. In no time, equipment, chutes, and helmets were on, each paratrooper helping the man nearest him. The crew chief detached the plane's cargo door and stowed it out of the way. On the ground, no change had taken place. There was little movement either by the armor or our personnel on the Sebreka. My next order was, hook up. Each paratrooper hooked his static line to the anchor cable and automatically checked the parachute of the man next to him. Then the last man scheduled to jump sang out, 14 OK, then the next, 13 OK, then 12 OK, and then down to me, 1 OK. The plane was slowing down now. Major Obendorf was approaching the drop zone he'd selected. The crew chief, on his back, waited to give the equipment canister a hefty shove with his feet. "Stand in the door," I commanded over my shoulder. The men in the rear of the plane moved up until all of us were lockstep. The bell started ringing in short dots. Bring, bring, bring. We were almost at the drop point. Then the dots ceased and the steady long bring replaced them. I nodded my head to the crew chief. Out went the container. Close behind it, I jumped, the others following me, one after another. An abrupt jerk on my shoulders told me that the silk was open, so I looked up and around. On one side, the red equipment chute with its container underneath floated some yards away. On the other side were my companion paratroopers. We were beating the container to the earth. As the ground came up, it seemed strewn with sizable rocks, and not at all the smooth surface it had appeared from the plane. Then, whomp! The earth stopped my descent. Some distance away, the last man from our plane was landing on a hillside. Paratroopers and the 5 troop carriers following us were jumping now, until all had disgorged their loads. The air seemed filled with white silk, the paratroopers underneath twisting, turning, striving to make a safe landing. On the ground, others who disengaged from the equipment were springing at the containers and dragging out musette bags, extra ammunition, and anti-tank guns. But something had happened to me in the womp. A rock or a piece of equipment or something else had struck into my lower ribs. With some effort and spitting of blood, I moved my carcass sufficiently to undo the harness. Captain Morrow and Lieutenant Berkner assembled their units behind a rock wall. Then, with anti-tank men leading, the assembled paratroopers moved out, approved methods of creeping and crawling. It was slow going. Closer to the road they advanced. In half an hour, the foremost anti-tank men stopped, stood up, yelled back in a disappointed voice, "Those vehicles have stars. They're American." It was true. They were part of the American armored force, which had broken through early that morning. Well, at least we were among friends. But what an undramatic ending to our first combat jump. So, that's kind of a hectic chapter, and I'm going to do my best to explain what had happened. In the long flight and the failure of the pathfinding beacons, the formation of the battalion got broken up. And I know now, reading the history, that some of the men landed in Spain. They were so lost, and Colonel Raff's own serial only numbered half a dozen airplanes by the time it reached the North African coast. And this is actually due not only to a lack of pathfinding beacon, but horrible weather off the coast of Spain. So they got hit with essentially everything went wrong. but Colonel Raff still made the jump. And then once they had made the jump, since they hit the coastline 100 miles where they were supposed to be, it took them longer than expected to get where they were supposed to be. And by the time they got there, the American armor was already there, which they mistook for enemy tanks. They still made the jump. They were still ready to go. They were ready to get after it. But much to his disappointment, they were American tanks, and they were not going to engage armor at that time. So here we go. Back to the book. One way I was lucky. In the landing on the rocky hillside, I had sustained my first real jump injury. Instead of being the usual leg or back variety, it turned out to be at least one broken rib, possibly two. I never did find out. Captain Alden, one of the surgeons, strapped me up, then told me I'd better stay behind near the planes. Later, he sanctioned my riding in a jeep belonging to the armored force across the Srebrenica, there to wait until the battalion caught up. An hour or so rest afforded by that jeep ride saved me from being a casualty then and later on. Frankly, I was disgusted with myself. So here he is, Edson Raff, fired up, ready to lead his men in combat, and he's pissed off that he suffered a jump injury. But that's not going to stop him. He has broken ribs. He takes an hour to rest, commandeers a jeep, and he's back at it. Even though he doesn't give himself much credit and he's disgusted with himself, as he says, he's getting after it and he is leading his men. All right, my apologies. The dog was going ballistic. Yeah, the dog was going ballistic. He heard something at the door, so I apologize. Back at it. After their first combat jump, the 2503rd Parachute Infantry Battalion is assigned another mission. Back to the book. General Anderson wants you to go to Tebessa, was the first thing that the brigadier said. Fine. When? On the 15th. What's the mission? To deny the aerodrome to the Axis. Here's the only map we have. Look it over. Remember, Tebessa's cold and high. Carry enough food and ammunition to last 6 days. As soon as it was possible to break away, I hurried to Maison Blanche to acquaint my officers and men with their new lease on life. They were delighted with the information. Everything looked inviting. So here they go. They got another assignment, possible action. They're fired up. They're ready to go. Their commander's like, fine, let's do it. When? What do you want us to do? Let's do it. So moving on in the book. Originally, we were going to jump at Tebessa, but on November 14th, by the merest fluke, 2 Frenchmen engaged me in conversation on the Maison Blanche aerodrome. They had recently, that day in fact, come from Tunis. I asked them for information about the city, about Bizart and Bone. Then, casually leading up to it, I inquired if they had ever been to Tebessa. The little fellow who spoke French only said that he'd been there during the last war, meaning 1939 to 1940 when the Germans invaded, at a place called Ep.6. Ux had been used as a landing field for French bombers. Bombers? Why bombers there? I queried. To bomb Tripoli, of course. How large is it? Bigger than the Tebessa airport? 3 times as large, he answered. Can you show me the location on this map? We had a French flying map, the only kind available. Certainly, right there. He drew a little square on the north side of the road from Tebessa to Constantine, opposite the word Ux. That square was the sole definite information Major Wanamaker, the flight leader, had to find the drop zone at Ep.6. What a contrast to the invasion jump. When the First Army heard about this other landing ground, they agreed we must deny both it and Tebessa aerodrome to the Axis. So that part of the book's pretty cool. So here we are, Edson Raff doing his thing, making personal relationships with the French there who know the area much better than anybody. They don't have any good maps. And this is something interesting I can contribute to the podcast from some individual primary source documents that I'm aware of, that I own, some original maps. I have in my possession an original invasion map copied from a French road map dated 1939, so it's a little bit out of date by 1943, but it's all they had. And it does not show the airfield of Ep.6. It's not on the map. So it's exactly as Edson Raff describes. The Americans, therefore, had no idea it was there. They had no idea that this larger, more useful airfield was in the middle of the desert. So here's Edson Raff making those relationships and altering the course of the war. So, with that French map, I also was able to receive a German map, which is a markedly better map. It's a topographic, full color. It shows the airfield at Ep.6. So the Germans knew it was there. The Americans didn't. The Germans would have captured it if the Americans didn't know it was there. Americans probably would have landed too late. The Germans did. They beat the British to an airfield when the British were conducting an airborne drop. So the Germans and the Americans and the British, the Allies, they were scrambling for airfields at this time in Tunisia. So this turns out to be a very crucial, casual conversation that Edson Raff has, where he discovers the intelligence of this second aerodrome. So here we are, they're departing on their second jump, and remember, Edson Raff, he's injured. So get this, last-minute adjustments were made to parachute equipment. Sergeant McLaney, our chief rigger, made a felt pad to go between the parachute snap fastener and my busted rib to cushion the pressure there. This pad he now sewed to my jumpsuit. So Edson Raff is not going to miss anything. He's not going to miss leading his men into battle, even though he doesn't know how many ribs he's broken. He was coughing up blood when he jumped and got injured, but he just has him sew a pad onto his jump coat so he can put on the harness and jump out of an airplane again. This guy is just the shit. I'm sorry for cursing, but it's the truth, folks. This is why I'm bringing this guy to you. Edson Raff, paratrooper commander to the end. Our departure was entirely different from the night's takeoff from England. In fact, everything about the flight reminded me very much of training trips we had made in Great Britain, when all thoughts pointed towards a flight to France or Holland or Belgium instead of North Africa. In those days, which seemed years ago, we had skimmed over the Bristol Channel. Just that morning, we skimmed over the Mediterranean. But now, we were on our way to what? So moving ahead in the book, nearer we drew to the oasis of Ep.6. It was due to be to the right of the road we were following, close by the mountains. On and on we flew. Yes, there's Ukes, somebody cried. But the field, the landing ground, where was it? Everything looked the same. Tebessa was ahead, larger than Ukes, and nestled closer to the mountains. There was the railroad and the road with automobiles on it, and a camel caravan. But as for a landing ground of any sort, every flat looked just like the next one and the one before it. Finally, we made a 180-degree turn, flew north of the road, still looking for the drop zone. Opposite Ukes on the road, 3 or 4 cars were parked, just as they are when jumps are made at Fort Benning Parachute School. It flashed through my mind, this must be the place. Major Wanamaker nodded his head, meaning, there it is, and pointed down. The crew chief, who was making ready to give our equipment canister a customary shove, yelled, "There are the soldiers! They're in trenches below!" Well, it was too late now. We had to go. I gave the crew chief our prearranged signal, a nod of the head, yelling, "Go, go!" He pushed the container out, and we jumped. Major Yarborough bringing up the rear. I had a fleeting glimpse of Thompson in the air. with his chute safely opened. He seemed to be turning and turning. So pausing here in the book and letting you know what's going on, this is not good. They have found where they're jumping, and there are defensive positions with troops in trenches, machine guns. They're ready to receive the paratroopers. The French have been fighting up to this point, so we're not sure what they're going to do. And this is not good. They're jumping into no cover to be engaged by men who are undercover in pre-prepared defensive positions. But Raff is like, let's do it, let's go. Default aggressive. I love it. And this guy Thompson, he mentions, he's a reporter who's caught up with the parachute battalion at this time. And they just put a parachute on him, gave him a helmet, was like, yeah, let's go. This is his first jump. Thompson jumping, and I have read this guy's articles written and sent back detailing this awesome jump. Awesome primary documents, the Chicago Tribune articles that Thompson wrote. I digress. Maybe I'll bring those to you in another podcast. I digress. I had a fleeting glimpse of Thompson in the air. With his chute safely opened, he seemed to be turning and turning. A quick descent from 350 feet leaves little time for thoughts. I had only two. First, there must be Frenchmen in those trenches. No shots are being fired. Then, how in the world did this carbine, which was in my hand, get tangled in the shroud lines? Then, plunk, both feet hit the mud of the field, and like the others, I was in the prone position, was struggling to get out of the harness. This tense moment is always critical in a paratrooper's life and is really much shorter than one thinks. Nonetheless, it is longer for us Americans than it should be. For us yet, we had not adapted a quick release device to rid ourselves of the harness. If the enemy is firing, this moment may mean life or death. Most of the men were down now. All planes, except one, were already on the return journey. The last plane was completing a circuit of the field, dropping supply baskets containing extra rations, ammunition, and blankets. One pannier was dropped every 100 yards outside our group on the ground. The chutes attached to the baskets normally billow out, letting the load down more or less gently. On this occasion, few chutes opened, however, and the heavily laden containers came crashing onto the terra firma with a thud. The French later said they had to duck into their slit trenches to save themselves from this heavy bombardment. Luckily, no damage was done to the personnel or to the container's contents. So, they make their second jump on the Ep.6 aerodrome, and cutting to the chase, the French do not fight, which is lucky for the battalion. Because if they had been engaged from those pre-positioned slit trenches, it turns out there was heavy artillery and machine guns in position. If they'd been engaged there, that would have been bad news. They would have taken heavy casualties. And the French were really impressed by the parachute jump. They said it was the finest thing they'd seen in a long time, and the French commander awards Colonel Edson Raff a French medal. And there's a picture taken of Raff looking very pleased with himself, getting this medal pinned on his chest. And maybe I'll bring that picture to you in a later publication. But these men have now made 2 combat jumps into North Africa, really at the forefront of the invasion. Little intelligence compared to later jumps like Normandy where everything's planned. I mean, I have a issued invasion map, going back to maps because the primary documents I personally own. I have an invasion map of Normandy which shows every single hedgerow. It shows all the little orchards and all the railroads, all the towns, really well mapped. And in North Africa, they didn't have anything. They had an old French road map, 3 years out of date, 4 years out of date, that didn't even show crucial areas that they had to hand pencil in and then find by flying along roads. And then there's Colonel Edson Raff. Ribs broken. Gets a pad sewn onto his shirt so he can put on his parachute harness and make the jump and lead his men. And he ends up making awesome ties with the French there. And the dog's going crazy, so I think I'm going to end the podcast here. Stand by for podcast number 2. I got to go see what the dog's going off about. Stand by. Podcast number 2 is inbound next week. We're going to finish off the book and the Tunisian Task Force. Thank you. This has been Andy, signing off.